That is some rock and hard place to be. So here we are trying to champion human being, and we're trying to do it right and be right culturally sensitive and culturally aware. And it's a really hard place to be because we are the guidance there. Fortunately today, we're joined by LaToya Christian. She is a natural, conscious marketer and recently recognized as a media all-star by Adweek. She infuses culture into analytics to develop consumer-centric strategies for brands such as Target, Purina, AARP, and Unilever. Let's give a warm welcome to Group M Managing Director, LaToya Christian.
So I definitely believe that we in this room have a lot of power. As we saw in the last presentation, we are the ones that are really guiding and dictating the images and narratives that are put out into the marketplace on a day-to-day basis. In my role, I lead cultural strategy and analytics at Group M, as the MC stated, and I'm often asked by people, how did you take on a role that infuses both marketing and culture? And I can think back to a time in my childhood when my curiosity was first sparked as it pertains to learning about other people different from me, and culture at large. And it takes me back to Christmas when I was 10 years old, and I received a beautiful globe that year. And it lit up. Now bear with me, I'm 10, so that's a big deal, right? And when it lit up, I saw reflected back to me images of people and places all around the world. And that was extremely dynamic for me. When I asked my mom, why exactly did you give me this gift? What she stated back was, I wanted you to know how big and how diverse the world was, despite what you saw in front of you on a daily basis. And what she was referring to was my South Jersey suburban upbringing, where me and my sister were normally the only kids of color in any classroom, and there were definitely not a lot of families that had strong Caribbean accents in our neighborhood. Based on that, I wanted to understand how the neighborhood and community that I grew up in had changed over the years. And what I found was there had been a 67% increase in ethnically and racially diverse households in that community since I was a kid. Now that would have been very convenient and good for me growing up, but that also mirrors what we're seeing happening in the overall US landscape in terms of the population shift. Oh, did I turn it off? There we go. So as I stated, the neighborhood I grew up in had increased 67% in terms of ethnically and racially diverse families. And what we're seeing is that this is also happening very rapidly in the US landscape. Since 2005, Asians, Hispanics, Blacks, and multiracial individuals have increased in population 33%, which is 2 times faster than what we see happening in the total population. To date, these individuals account for 40% of the population and growing. By the year 2045, the US will be a majority-minority nation. It was interesting, a white male colleague of mine told me the other day that he felt as though he is now the minority, and to a certain extent, that might be true in some rooms. But it's really indicative of just how the overall landscape is changing and what we need to pay attention to. As we think about the different groups and generations that we're trying to reach, we heard a lot about individuals, brands, and companies trying to reach millennials and Gen Zs. It's really important to understand just how diverse these groups are. Millennials and Gen Zs will be the most racially and ethnically diverse generations within US history. And while these groups are definitely, there are certain mindsets that are unified for these groups, it's really important to take into consideration their cultural identity. I had a client, say to me last year that they were really struggling to understand why their messaging strategy was falling flat. As I started to unpack the data, what I realized is that while the message was definitely universal, the audience that was growing their category was not being accounted for. As we dug a little bit deeper, we saw that we needed to account for the cultural nuances and mindset drivers that would definitely resonate with this audience. and the strategy did not account for that. Over 80% of Gen Zs and millennials do say that their cultural identity is important to them. As I mentioned to you before, I have Caribbean background, and so it's really important for me to make sure I personally am merging together my American upbringing with those cultural roots and heritage. And as a result, myself and others that may be similar to me definitely look to see themselves reflected in the content and media that's out there on a day-to-day basis. But the trouble is, there's a gap. We saw the team from Girl Gaze recently present the fact that women aren't feeling represented in media and advertising, and we see that these are the same truths for these audiences. Despite the fact that they're growing in terms of overall population, from a media and advertising perspective, we're not necessarily accounting for them. Now you may be saying, we're not necessarily excluding them either. But once again, we're not overtly including them in the messaging and the images that we're putting out there in the marketplace. And this is where some of the issues are coming in terms of the way that they feel brands are representing them, or in some cases, not representing them. Social media has played a huge role in allowing these audiences to feel like they're having their voices amplified. So we have to take into consideration the fact that these are groups of people that probably felt like they necessarily couldn't have their voices heard for a very long time. So social media has been a platform and an outlet which is allowing them to have their voices amplified and heard by the masses. We're seeing that 75% of these individuals are using social media to express themselves, and they feel like this is the way that they have to do it because they otherwise wouldn't have their voices heard. And they're 50% more likely to turn to social media to voice an issue that they may have with a brand or business. And that's some of the sentiment that we may be feeling from a brand and advertiser perspective if we get certain elements wrong. So I want to take you through a few examples that we've heard people say about specific brands. Clearly this brand has no diverse representation. This is pathetic. These are not the sentiments we want any consumers to say about the work that we're putting out there that is supposed to reflect them and that's supposed to connect with them in an effort to sell products. The one thing I would say here is that while the audience may definitely be vocal, and if they feel as though they're not necessarily getting that representation that they truly desire, they will cancel you. And we've seen a number of brands make the same mistakes a few times over, and or brands not learning from one another. And as strategists and marketers, there's really an opportunity to really take those learnings that we see that have been put out into the marketplace and course correct. Now, while we see that these audiences are very vocal and they're telling us what's going wrong, we also see that they will tell us what's going right. It's so nice to finally see myself reflected in media and commercials. I love, love, love this ad. It really means the world to me that more and more types of Black womanhood are being talked about. So this just goes to show you that representation does matter, and the images that we're putting out in the world are definitely being paid attention to. So you may be thinking, well, what does this creative look like? What does content that is representative, that really takes into account who the consumer and the audience are, what does that look like? So I'm going to share with you an example from my target client, which is one of my favorite clients, don't tell the other ones. We really leaned into the insight that we understood millennial moms were definitely disrupting what it meant to be a mother. They were really taking charge of motherhood and putting their own definition on it. But as we looked at a lot of the data and insights, what we found was that Black mothers specifically were having a different experience. There were a lot of misconceptions, there were a lot of stereotypes, and they felt like on a day-to-day basis they had to push back on some of these things in terms of them just showing up and being a good mother and what that looked like. And they did not see that reflected in the images and in the narratives as it pertained to motherhood. So along with our creative agency and with partners from a network, we wanted to go out and create content that really would speak to them. Here's what it looked like.
you always hear single mom, and I'm like, well, I'm not a single mom, I'm a single woman with a child because my daughter's father is very active in her life. So I'm a single woman with a child.
I think the biggest stigma is that we don't do things that other moms do. It doesn't. I garden, I ride my bike through the city with my husband, like, we do all of that stuff.
I really want my kids to know their limitless potential.
For more honest conversations about motherhood, go to oprah.com/theknow. Presented by Target.
So that's one of my favorite ads from that campaign. This is very sensitive. That was one of my favorite ads from that campaign, and we're doing more work to really make sure that not only are we letting the consumer know that we understand them, but that we see them and that we hear them. So now that we're on the next slide already, I want to transition into another form of identity that's just as equally important. So we talked about identity as it pertains to ethnicity and cultural representation. There's another dimension of identity that pertains to gender that's equally important. We know that gender doesn't necessarily exist only in the binary of terms such as she and he, and it really is a fluid way of seeing oneself. We know that body, identity, and expression all are important, and they all have an interrelationship in terms of how individuals want to be identified and talked to. Today, there are 53 gender identity terms that can be used. I would definitely encourage all of you, if you haven't had an opportunity to do so yet, to really immerse yourself on GLAAD.org to really learn more about all the gender identity terms. I am definitely not staying here saying that you need to know the definition of every single term, but what it is we need to understand that as a society and as individuals, we are evolving and expanding the way that we see gender and gender identity. And so therefore, as marketers and strategists, we need to follow suit. So we see that today, overwhelmingly, well, not overwhelmingly, but 52% of Americans are comfortable using gender-neutral pronouns to refer to someone. And 55% of Gen Z are currently utilizing gender-neutral pronouns to talk to their peers and even identify themselves. So this becomes, once again, increasingly important as we think about the audiences we're going after. If you are thinking about going after a Gen Z audience and not really being conscious of the way they're talking to one another, there's the opportunity that you might come off a little tone deaf, right? So we want to be very conscious and aware of this. We see that, once again, social media and in the social and digital landscape is a real driver in pushing the conversations and really bringing these topics to the forefront. We see that there are constant mentions around the terms non-binary and gender-neutral pronouns that are happening in the social media landscape, and overwhelmingly, 73% of the conversation is positive. The brands that have really leaned into this insight are really coming into the conversation and doing really well. Retailers such as Zara and H&M have deconstructed some of their clothing lines in an effort to be more gender inclusive. We saw that recently, about 2 weeks ago, I believe, it was toy manufacturer Mattel that came out with a gender neutral doll, and it was really understanding how the millennial parents were parenting and really wanting to have that level of inclusivity. Brands like that had over 85, that brand specifically had an 85% positive social sentiment when they released that doll. So the conversation is really positive that's happening around this topic. Here's an example from a brand, Sephora. We've seen a lot of beauty retailers and beauty brands specifically really embrace gender inclusivity as a whole. Sephora really embodied it in one of their most recent campaigns that I think is personally beautiful. They utilize a lot of terms, the gender neutral pronouns such as ze, we, they, them, in order to be fully inclusive in terms of who their full consumer is within their stores. Here's a clip.
Funny how a lonely day can make a person say, what good is my life? Funny how a breaking heart can make me start to say,
I personally think that that is a beautiful way to just highlight inclusivity from a gender perspective overall. And just to note for that specific ad, the social sentiment was in the 90s for Sephora when they released that. And I also want to note the fact that while it did launch during Pride Month, it ran outside of Pride Month as well, and it had the same level of sentiment across the board. So I shared a lot with you. And so I want to give you 5 ideas in terms of how to win with authenticity with the consumers that are definitely going to be driving a lot of the category growth in the marketplace. So first and foremost, immerse yourself in the unknown. And this is really just putting yourself out there as an individual. Talk to people who are different from you. Explore different neighborhoods. For those of you who live in New York, we have so many neighborhoods that are filled with so much culture. Definitely go to those places and spaces and really just seek out the unknown, right? And a lot of that might have to feel a little uncomfortable, but I also do believe in order for us to be successful, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Disrupt the growth strategy. As I mentioned before, the US landscape is changing, and we see that diverse and ethnic and racially diverse groups are the ones that are really driving the overall population growth, and across many categories, the category growth. So we really need to challenge ourselves and our clients as we look at the insights. Who is really driving the growth? Where is my success and my business coming from? Account for the and. It's not enough to just to go out into the marketplace and be one-dimensional. We need to account for all the different layers that shows up in terms of who someone is. We need to make sure that we're talking about women, we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about the roles you play. It can't necessarily just be one dimension. No one and done. I've seen a lot of brands do this where they dip their toes in. We're gonna try it with this audience, and it might not necessarily work. Oh, so this doesn't work. We shouldn't go out of our way to do this. That's not necessarily true. I'd love to think about this from taking a standpoint of a test and learn strategy. If you get it wrong, we can try again. And that's really the mindset and the attitude that we need to take here. So learn from the mistakes and try again. And seek out the experts. Across the marketing and media landscape, there is an expert for everything. And this area is no different. There are individuals, myself included, who definitely are very passionate about culture and society and impact in the way that it really manifests in terms of business and helps our clients. So you can definitely go out and find the people that can help guide you in this process if you feel as though you or your client or your agency does not necessarily have the in-house knowledge that you need. So in closing, I know I covered a lot, but I want to definitely remind us that we have so much power in this room. We are the individuals that get the briefs, we sit with the clients, we're looking at the data, and we really have an opportunity to really go out and make sure that we're accounting and showing up for individuals that don't always necessarily show up. So I would encourage you to utilize that power, think about what you're going to do with it, and really go make a difference. Thank you.
I feel like this is a somewhat foreign land that we're all doing our level best to navigate.
Yes.
And it's good to know that there are experts out there. So I want to start with a question that had come through about how you would respond to feedback. The representation, in some cases, of diversity or different identification feels like pandering.
To the audience?
Yeah, to some, like sometimes, is there a sense of the spirit in which it's done by some companies where it feels more like pandering than there's something real happening?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. So what I would definitely say is if you're coming from a place of genuinely looking at the insights and understanding what is going on in the mindset of the consumer, it shouldn't feel like pandering. It should feel like I see you, I'm showing up for you, not necessarily I'm preaching to you, right? So a lot of brands and companies feel like it's just showing up in terms of casting, right? Which in my opinion is a mere check in the box. It's really thinking about those universal insights that may exist, but then going a level deeper and thinking about the cultural nuances, so therefore that's what shows up in the work.
Okay.
So basically, the consumer shouldn't necessarily know that you're going out of your way.
It's a really good point. So the cultural sensitivity and the universal insights actually leads into the next question.
Okay.
So you said something about you personally merging your American upbringing with your Caribbean heritage.
Yeah.
You are a special you. I'm a special. Everybody in here is a very special them.
Yeah.
And there's a question of universality and specificity and how to do that. And you were also talking about the and. Did you do this? And did you take this into consideration? Someone's. So any helpful hints there about how to address that without getting into something that feels like it's a rigid personalization?
Right, or so niche that you don't have any scale, right?
Yeah, so that it feels like even though it might appear niche, it actually has a universality to it.
Absolutely. So I'll go back to the Target example that I utilize. So most of the clients that I work with, they're very large scale clients. So reaching the most people is always very important. But what we have a tendency to do is really put people in a monolithic group without accounting for any differentiation whatsoever. So we definitely like to look into the insights to see, okay, these are the universal things that everyone believes. So every mother wants to be a good mother, right? No one's gonna say, I wanna be a bad mother. Well, I don't know.
I tried really hard, but they're still alive.
But really understanding what does that lived experience look like for different individuals versus just the overall universal group. So when we think about the and, those are the types of things that we're referring to and really accounting for. So it might not necessarily be just from an aesthetic standpoint, but more so from a mindset standpoint and understanding what's going on in society, and then therefore that shows up in the work.
Okay. Good. What is the strongest case that we can make to clients that they need to do this?
I say follow the money. Honestly, I know, this feels really good and we want to do the right thing, and I wholeheartedly believe that, but at the end of the day, our responsibility is to help our clients drive their bottom line, which 9 times out of 10 is revenue or other KPIs. And so the way I look at this, what we do on the Group M side is we do a business opportunity analysis to really help our clients understand where is the growth in their category or their brand coming from. So I gave the example earlier on about my client that couldn't understand why they were failing with millennials despite all the work and all the universal insights that they had. And when we dug a little bit deeper, we saw that the individuals that were driving their category were, in that case, it was Hispanics. They really hadn't done anything to be nuanced for that consumer. They didn't take into consideration the barriers in the category that they might face. They didn't take into consideration anything from a language perspective. So it just fell flat. So I would definitely say follow the money, follow the growth, and based on where we're seeing the demographics go, that will lead you to these audiences.
You also end up doing, you talk about analyses where you're talking about where the money is growing, but you also show that it's sort of like, I always think about putting money in your mattress. If you put money in your mattress, it feels safe, but it's actually diminishing, right? It's right. That if they stood where they were, what would happen? If they just
I would question the sustainability of their business in the long term. I genuinely would, because the numbers speak for themselves. I would also say that one of the conversations we have internally quite a bit, especially on the media side, is around we're reaching them, right? So the media is reaching them. We do all the analyses. We know that we're hitting them from an impression standpoint, but we're not connecting with these audiences. So there's no level of loyalty. There's no affinity there. So we really haven't gone out of our way to really make sure that our brand has a connection and therefore a role in their lives.
So reaching them, not connecting with them.
Absolutely.
That's a really nice note to end on. Thank you
Thank
very much.